I'm Randy Southard. I'm a soil scientist at the University of California, Davis, and today we'll be talking about soil basics as part of the soil health module. First of all, let's ask ourselves a question. What are soils? Some of us may think of soils as things that we buy in a bag at the nursery to grow our tomatoes. Others may think of soil as the stuff that's under our fingernails. Others may think of soils as a medium for plant growth. Others may think about materials that are on Mars and the moon that might be considered soils. And those are all parts of what people have as a thought about what soils are. But in some cases, we try to restrict, from a soil science point of view, what we think about soils as being, and some of the important elements of what differentiates soils from not soils. So first of all, sort of a dry definition, but one that's good to hold on to. Soils are three-dimensional bodies. They occupy space, they occupy volume. They're vertically differentiated. In general, they're not the same from top to bottom. They're naturally occurring bodies that occur at the Earth's surface, and they're a combination in varying degrees of mineral and organic matter. And we differentiate soils from geologic materials because soils have been affected by the interaction of chemical, physical, and biological processes, and in particular the biological processes that help differentiate soil materials from geologic materials. And these chemical, physical, and biological processes are controlled by a number of environmental factors that affect how soils form and how they behave. So we can think of soils as natural bodies on the landscape. Soils really are not materials in pots. We refer to that as soil materials. Soils are living entities that are out on the landscape, that are represented then by small units that we refer to as pedons. We'll talk about that a little bit later. An aggregation of pedons on the landscape that we think of as being the soil individual. It really captures the range of characteristics of the soils. And then the various polypedons or groups of soils out on the landscape that really make up the vibrant surface of the Earth. And an example shown in the picture here is the California state soil, which is the San Joaquin series that represents some of the excitement of soils that can occur within a profile in a pedon. And a nice way to capture all of that essence of what a soil is the phrase that Konstantin Nikiforov used. He referred to soils as the excited skin of the Earth's crust, and I'd like to share that excitement with you today. First of all, we could ask ourselves, what are soils made of? And in fact, soils are made of mineral materials. We'll talk a little bit about what minerals are, about organic matter that comes from the cycling of organisms, plants, animals, microbes. The organisms themselves, a large part of the organic fraction is actually made up of living organisms. And those constitute then the solid fraction. So minerals and organic matter are the solid fraction. And then the remainder of a soil volume is made up of pore space. And so we oftentimes may not think about soil material when we look at a chunk of it in our hand or when we walk across the ground. But the reality is that about half of the volume of soil material is pore space. And that pore space then, depending on the chemistry and the biology and the physics of the situation, may either be filled with solution, soil water, if you will, or soil air, or soil atmosphere. So a combination then of liquids and gases can be in that pore space, and that pore space then represents, as I mentioned, about half of the volume of a soil material. So to follow on to that notion, we think of the soil as a three-phase system characterized by solid particles, kind of a cartoon at the top of particles of organic matter and minerals. And then below, a picture of what soils really look like in thin sections. So if we cut a slice of soil, look at it under a microscope, and project that image, we see that soils are actually very heterogeneous. They're not nearly as homogeneous as the the picture at the top shows. They're combinations of fine and coarse particles, the pores, in this case, filled with air, and maybe some of the dark material in the bottom, representative of the organic fraction. So just as a reminder, about half solids, about half pores, and depending on the circumstances, those pores could be filled with liquids or gases. Now we might come to the conclusion then that, well, soils are three-dimensional bodies and they're vertically differentiated by soil-forming processes. But I want to ask the question is, do we think that all soils are the same? Are soils in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan similar to the soils in Manhattan, Kansas, or similar to the soils in Sao Paulo, Brazil? And understand maybe why the soils might not be the same. And the answer to this question is no. When we mention the definition of soils, we talk about the interaction of chemical, biological, and physical processes that are dictated or controlled by external factors, environmental conditions. And we refer to these environmental conditions as the factors of soil formation. The concepts of factors of soil formation started with V.V. Dokoshev in the late 1880s in Russia, evolved through the early 1900s, and were formalized by Hans Jenny in what we typically think of as the factors of soil formation equation that tells us that the state of the soil is a function of the interaction of 5 soil forming factors: climate, which is precipitation and temperature; organisms, which can include plants and animals; humans; microbes that interact with the mineral material of the soil; the lay of the land, if you will, the relief or the topography. How steep is the landscape so that water might run off the soil and cause erosion, or is it flat so that water can penetrate the soil and participate in soil forming processes? And then the parent material of the soil can either be mineral material, it could be organic material, but this is where the geologic aspects of soil formation comes in. That's the starting material from which the soil can develop. And then how old is the landscape, or time as a soil forming factor? And when we think about the age of soils, soils can be as young as a few minutes if after a flood deposits new materials, or in some cases they may be a couple million years old on some of the most stable parts of the Earth's surface. So these are the soil forming factors that drive or control soil forming processes. And because, as we can imagine, the soil forming factors or the environmental conditions vary widely across the globe, so for that reason, we produce a wide array of soils, varying kinds of soil properties. And there are classification systems that have been developed to try to capture and explain the variability of soils and to organize soil information into a system that allows for communication about soil properties. Shown here is an example of some of the variety of soils found on the Earth using the nomenclature of the U.S. soil taxonomy system, the U.S. classification system. It consists of 12 soil orders that capture the range of soil properties from the equator to the poles, here in the Western Hemisphere and similarly in the Eastern Hemisphere. So the notion here at this point is that there's quite a bit of heterogeneity in soils as a function of the soil forming environment. Soils are not the same everywhere, and that these chemical, physical, and biological processes that produce soils are driven by global environmental conditions. Now, I mentioned that there are 12 soil orders. I'll show 4 examples of some pedons or profiles of soil, 2-dimensional slices of soils that help capture and portray the array of soil properties that one might encounter around the globe. This is an example of a soil order called histosols. Histosols consist of organic soil materials, which are dominated in their properties by organic materials derived from plants and animals. They typically, in this example, are found in soils that have high water tables that retain water for long periods of time so that organic matter is very slow to decompose. It tends to accumulate. Relatively weakly developed soils are called inceptisols. We can think of them as being in the inception of soil formation. This is an example of an inceptisol formed on hard limestone, relatively resistant to weathering, and so produces a relatively shallow soil with not a lot of horizon differentiation, so not very strongly vertically differentiated. In the land of the volcanoes, one of the representative soil orders are called the andesols. These typically, not always, but typically form from volcanic materials, in particular volcanic ash. That leads to an interesting suite of water holding capacity properties, and in particular, the ability to store or fix phosphorus to make it relatively unavailable to plants. Relatively rare soils found associated with the tectonic plates that give rise to volcanoes around the globe, primarily in the region called the Pacific Ring of Fire. And lastly, an example of soils from arid regions. These are called iridosols, where the balance between precipitation and evapotranspiration is favored by evapotranspiration, and for that reason, soluble salts and calcium carbonate tends to accumulate in these soils, and they're not as intensively leached as soils in more humid regions. So just 4 of the 12 examples, but I think from the slides portrayed, you can see that there are big differences in this kinds of soil properties depending on where the soils occur and depending on the interaction of those soil forming factors. We've shown 2-dimensional slices of soils, but in reality, as we mentioned, soils are 3-dimensional. They occupy volume, they have a certain area on the surface of the earth, and then they penetrate to some depth below the surface. It's not a fixed depth. The depth varies depending on the soil forming environment. And we call this 3-dimensional body a pedon, which is the smallest unit of soil that we can think of as a soil entity. And we have terminology that help describe the properties associated with the vertically differentiated pedon. And there are several of them to keep in mind. The first one is called an O horizon, which consists of organic soil material. These can either be found in poorly drained soils or in the forest floor of coniferous and deciduous forests. A horizons are mineral in composition. They are dominated by mineral properties, but they have an intimate association with organic matter. Sometimes this is referred to as topsoil, but topsoil is sort of an imprecise term. So the A horizon, usually darkened by humified organic matter in conjunction with mineral materials. E horizons are horizons from which relatively soluble components have been leached and mobilized. We use the term eluviated, which is a mnemonic device for the E horizon, to think about compounds that have been moved out of that part of the soil. Those could include clays, organic matter, calcium carbonate, iron and aluminum compounds, other soluble salts that have been leached from those horizons. If materials can be moved in the soil from A and E horizons, they can also accumulate in the soil. So we refer to subsurface horizons wherein materials have accumulated. We refer to those as B horizons. Also horizons where in situ alteration has occurred, we also refer to as B horizons. So these are very heterogeneous horizons in the subsurface that represent a wide array of soil forming processes of alteration and accumulation. Relatively unaffected materials are called sea layers. These do not include bedrock, so hard bedrock, we have another term for that, but sea material is relatively unconsolidated but not much affected by soil formation. Hard bedrock is a capital R that represents then the materials that have not been transported but are potentially formed in place. Those are the most common horizons that we encounter in soils. There are a few others. We have opportunities to describe layers of water, either frozen or liquid. Human-made layers, like asphalt or landfill liners that represent root-limiting layers. You can think of a Walmart parking lot that gets buried by a flood, might be an example of an M layer, an L layer, biologically produced materials deposited in water, and then lastly, a V horizon, which is a horizon usually near the surface that's dominated by vesicular pores. So a number of different kinds of horizons that represent the vertical differentiation of soils that we can encounter depending on the dominance of soil forming factors and processes. So if we wanted to capture some of the variability, in the previous examples, we've captured some of the variability at different kinds of soil forming environments, but within a soil itself, a pedon description, when we describe the soils, we note that there are a number of properties that vary from one horizon to the next. So an A3 horizon overlies a 2BT1 horizon, and some of the differences between the soil materials are highlighted. So in the first case, we have a loam over a clay, we have blocky structure over prismatic structure, we have engineering properties called consistence, how hard the material, how sticky and plastic it is. Those properties differ as a function of depth. We describe roots and pores, and we define some distribution of iron that's been moved around because the soil has become wet and reduced for periods of time. We also refer to the acidity of the soil and the transition from one horizon to the next. So a lot of detail in a pedon description, but an illustration then of the kinds of properties that are captured in describing a pedon and differentiating one horizon from the next. So the idea of a vertically differentiated material, the definition of soil. And we also think of soils, now that we understand a little bit about what soils are, we recognize that soils are a reservoir. They're a reservoir of nutrients, which we'll talk about briefly now, and then in a subsequent lecture, we'll talk about them as reservoirs for water. So there's 17 plant essential nutrients. Those are nutrients that are required for reproduction and growth of the plants. And there's a mnemonic device that we use to help remember those 17. 13 of which, by the way, come from soils, 3 of which come from the air, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and nitrogen that comes from the soil through nitrogen fixation. So 13 of these plant nutrients come from the soil. The mnemonic device is C. Hopkins Cafe, mighty good. Cousin Mo cleans nightclub by midnight. And it helps us remember those 17 essential plant nutrients that plants take up by the roots and use in plant physiological processes.